Welcome to episode 40 of Radio Omnicore. This is a great episode we have lined up for you, and the topic is all around psychological safety and creating employee voice in your organization. Our guest, Vincent Rossignol, has done some research in this, and he shares his findings during this episode. Fascinating ideas around leadership, how to engage with your team, how to encourage connection and create places and forums for your employees to speak up. It'll be a very valuable session for leadership, for coaches, and for human resource practitioners. I really think you're going to find this valuable. It's wonderful to be here for episode 40, which is really epic. Hilton, you remember when we started this podcast 3 years ago? It was a bit of a fantasy, and here we are, episode 40, and we've got a wonderful guest in the studio to share in our anniversary, which is Vincent, and he's going to be speaking to us about psychological safety. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you so much for having me, and happy anniversary, by the way.
Thank you. Welcome, Hilton.
Thanks. Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation with Vincent.
Yeah, so I think just a bit of context to how poor Vincent ended up on this podcast. We were just sharing a discussion around psychological safety. I think if I remember, I shared an article with you. And Vincent shared with me that he recently handed in his dissertation, and his topic was around psychological safety and employees speaking up and how that works with leadership styles. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to share with our listeners, who I think they're going to find this very interesting, just a bit more about this topic, especially during the times of remote working and COVID. So Vincent, why don't you just start off with giving us a high-level intro and maybe what's keeping you up at night, what you're busy with right now?
Great. So thank you, Colin. And yes, so my name is Vincent. As you rightly said, I'm French. So I'm sorry about the accent. That's actually, something I've never managed to overcome. You will have the pleasure to have a French accent during the podcast. I've been living in South Africa for the past 6-7 years. I relocated here through my company. I work for Novartis. That is a pharmaceutical company. We basically, make drugs available in most of the Sub-Saharan markets, and that's one of the things I'm currently busy doing. So if you look at my background, I'm actually a person who's done management in different positions. I graduated from a business school. I have a corporate MBA. I've worked in finance for a long period of time, for the first 15 years of my life. And recently I moved into more general management roles because I wanted to explore what's happening beyond the numbers and make sure I have a greater connection to the people. And that's something that really passionated me and still passionates me, on an ongoing basis. And because of that interest in managing teams and managing people, I also decided to do a master in business psychology recently, which I just completed a few months ago. And that's exactly what you said. I mean, the topic for my research that I had to do for the dissertation was around speaking up in the workplace and how, servant leadership influences how people, relate and speak in the workplace. So that's the topic for the discussion today. The proud dad of a 2-year-old, so I'm hoping she will not scream today and you won't hear her on the call. And yes, and my passion in life is just to make sure that we help people fulfilling their dreams and achieving their potential, which is why I'm here today and hoping that I can contribute to the discussion.
So thanks so much, Vincent. I did have a look through your thesis, and it was very interesting. I mean, maybe just for our audience, you could elaborate just on this constructive voice and the different types of voices in organization and why it's such an important cultural artifact.
So, yeah, and the reason, I wanted to focus on voice is that you hear a lot about speaking up in the workplace and what that means and the impact it can have for leaders in different organizations. But I think it's quite difficult to understand exactly what that encompasses. The first aspect is, if you think of employee voice, that's basically any of the mechanism that you give to your employees or your associate to participate in the decision-making process of an organization. So it's very broad as a concept, and that was something that when you come and step in as a manager to try to free up the channels of communication in your organization, if you think along those broad terms, it's becoming very difficult to look at what are the actions that you can put in place to make sure that people speak up. So in the research that I did, basically, I took the stance of looking at employee voice from two perspectives, which is something that has been developed quite recently. And that's to separate what we call promotive voice, which is when employees express their ideas to improve the organizational settings, and separate that from prohibitive voice. Because prohibitive voice in that respect is basically when somebody speaks up about their concerns about the organization, the rules and practices that they're not happy with. And if you try to put the two of them together, you basically realize that they are very different concepts. If I go to my manager and tell him, actually, I have an idea of things that we could do, that could give us access to new opportunities, it's a very different tone and very different setup that you create for the conversation compared to going to your manager and telling him, actually, I'm not happy about the way that you've dealt with that situation, or I'm not happy about my colleague, or I'm not happy about the strategic decisions that you're making. And because, these discussions are very different from one another, it becomes quite interesting to start looking at what drives them and how, the different styles of leadership or the different elements of leadership can influence one versus the other in order to be able to play with a bigger toolkits on how to enhance those conversations in the workplace.
It's not really that one's better than the other. Both are necessary, right? You want employers to feel free to be able to critique organizational functioning and to provide proactive content for the organization. Am I understanding you right, that you want both of those to coexist?
Yes, no, exactly. And at the end of the day, if you think of employee voice, it's a bit like a market research that you do in your organization. It's gathering all of the insights that you have from people in order to understand what's happening in your units. And both aspects are very relevant for the discussion. You want to understand what are the things that you could consider doing that you're not currently doing yet, and because that's new ideas and changes that you can anticipate. But you also want to understand what you're not doing so well in order to course correct and make the necessary adjustment and changes in your setup. But I think the part that is quite critical to understand is that people will engage much more easily into promotive voice in the sense that they're not threatening. If you go to somebody and tell them, I have an idea and I would like to test that, it's much easier to have those conversations than to go to somebody of in a management position in an organization and tell them, this is not working. Because of the fact that you're criticizing something that is already in place, there's a judgmental aspect that comes with that, and that creates a lot of exposure for the people voicing that. And so that's why you need to really understand what are the different dynamics at play here in order to make sure that you protect your employees the best way and create the psychological safety that they need in order to come forward with some of the key things that is on their mind.
Yeah, I think this is really where we get to connect in terms of our product offering at Omnicore and what you're speaking about. And the idea of psychological safety and giving employees, associates a space to feel that they can speak that isn't career limiting. I think we've learned that to have those focus groups with an outside person coming in, just giving people the opportunity to speak with, total confidentiality and anonymity, really gives us a different lens, just instead of just the numbers that our talent engagement survey looks at, that but sometimes is very surprising. And then maybe just, Vincent, if you could just explain what you mean by psychological safety, and also why has it become such a buzzword, do you think?
So psychological safety, I think, it's a very broad term, and you can think of it as, to which extent you create a space for your employees to speak freely, about what is on their mind. And I think that's something that is quite critical and quite difficult also to achieve for an organization, because it's quite an intangible product. You can't just describe psychological safety. It's the fact that each and everybody in the organization will trust each other, will make sure that they're happy about their relationships, and it's something that is really difficult to somehow describe per se on intangible terms. In terms of when you think of safety, there's actually quite a few things that the research has shown that helps to drive that conversation. And for instance, different forms of leadership will influence psychological safety in different ways, and that's why for me I was focusing on servant leadership to see how that relates to psychological safety, because that was something that was quite prominent in the research. I think the second part of your question was about why is it such a buzzword right now, and why does everybody want to create psychological safety in the organization. And I see, there are different aspects to it. The first one is that if you have psychological safety, then people will come to the fore and mention some of the ideas or some of the things that needs to happen, and that's the employee voice. And basically it will create a greater level of innovation in your organization. It will help you to be more productive. It drives greater engagement in the workplace. There's a lot of positive elements that are linked to it, and that's why everybody looks at it like the panacea and the grail, in the sense that can help another organization to be much more efficient and much more successful if you achieve that state of psychological safety in your organization. But I think also, and that's my personal feeling, I don't think that that's something that I've read yet in the research, but if you look at the current status of people in the organization and what has happened over the past 10 or 20 years, I think with the development, for instance, of social media, we've given to employees and to associates and to everyone in the workplace basically the hint that their opinion matters and that they have a say in whatever is happening around them. And so, the concept of voice has somehow been really expanded over the past few years, because social media is also very closely linked to voice, and the fact that it creates channels for people to express their opinions in a way that didn't exist in the past. So if you want to be in tune with what's happening around you and in your society and in your culture, you need also to integrate that in the workplace and make sure that you create mechanism for people to voice what is happening on their side. And that's why, it has become such a critical element of a strategy for a company.
So maybe to get a little bit more practical, Vincent, if I was part of an organization that really bought into these constructs of psychological safety and voice, and I felt that my organization didn't have enough of that, and I wanted to introduce it into the organization, how do you educate the organization? Is it training sessions for managers, or is there something more abstract that kind of has to happen to make this a part of your culture inside of an organization?
So Hilton, that's where maybe I will link it back to the work I've done as part of my dissertation. The work I've done was to look at how a type of leadership like servant leadership enhance voice mechanisms in the workplace. And basically, because servant leadership is such a broad concept, I looked at what are the different aspects within servant leadership that actually is actually directly related to voice and to the different types of voice, to see, is that specific component of servant leadership linked to promotive voice, and is the other one linked to prohibitive voice, or how does that work? And it was actually quite interesting because, I can go in detail, but maybe I will start, from a high-level perspective. I thought that the component that would drive the voice mechanism from on Storger's side was the altruist concept within servant leadership. The fact that you're here to be at the service of others and that you really want to help others in the first place. And so, I was like, okay, because you do those kind of interactions and you really put others on the forefront, people will reciprocate and also try to support you by giving you feedback and by, voicing whatever they have on their mind. And for me, that was a bit of the expectation that what I would find from the research. What actually came very significantly in the findings and based on the survey and the sample I had is that part is actually not directly related to voice. It's not because you pay attention to others that people will reciprocate and give you feedback. What I realized is two elements were actually linked to voice. One was the wisdom, what we call the wisdom of the leader, meaning is the leader aware of what's happening in the workplace? And can the leader, look at the big picture and understand what this relates to in terms of business opportunities, in terms of team dynamics, in terms of those kind of things? And so that was one aspect that was related to both the promotive and the prohibitive voice. And then the other aspect that was quite interesting was a concept that is called emotional healing, which is the ability of a leader to speak about, the emotional states of themselves and their followers, and make sure that they support the followers whenever they're in a difficult situation, or the followers or associates when they're in a difficult situation, to make sure that they're here for them, they stand by them, and they help them navigate, those emotional states. And emotional healing was actually linked to prohibitive voice, which, if you want to try to picture what that means, it's basically, you speak to an associate about a difficult time that they're going through, and because they understand that you're here for them and you're interested and you want to listen to them, then they will expand on what's happening on their side. And sometimes, those difficult situations that associates actually go through can be linked to something happening in the workplace. And that's why they will voice, what is not working well in the workplace, where they need support, and the kind of distress that they can face. So those two elements, the emotional healing and the wisdom, are actually the two ones that came forward as being directly related to voice. So now if we bring it back and try to reflect on what that means in terms of, if you want to help people in the workplace navigate or develop psychological safety, I think it basically implies that first you need to express the fact that you don't know everything. Because if you do that, basically you start from the assumption that people need to help you understand what's happening. And that's the relationship that we had seen on the wisdom side. If people understand that you don't know everything, then they will come forward and help you fill in the gaps. So the more you do that, and the more you show that you're not actually comfortable with everything that's happening, you don't know everything, etc., it helps people speaking up. And the other aspect is emotional healing. Basically means that you need to have an emotional agenda in how you manage your workforce, and make sure that these topics are actually topics that you can discuss. You can discuss core emotions. You can discuss what that means for you, for your team, the things that people navigate, and bring a bit more of yourself in the workplace than what is usually understood, because that's what unleashes the conversation in the workplace.
So, Vincent, the things you're talking about seem to require a high level of psychological sophistication, a level of benevolent leadership. But, when I hear about voice and emotional healing, a lot of leaders, the kind of personality attributes of leaders may not align with those psychological constructs. So you may have leaders who are much more concrete, maybe perhaps more autocratic. So I guess what I'm asking is there like a personality component of leadership that works better with a kind of promotive voice and psychological safety? And there's other leaders for whom it's just a very foreign construct and more difficult for them to get into that mode.
Yes, and I think, that's, for me, that's actually what triggered the research at the beginning, because what we've seen is that prosocial behaviors or prosocial leaderships, the one that basically puts the environment and the people around you in the forefront, are usually more directly linked to voice in the workplace. So, if you want to get the feedback from your associates about what's happening or the ideas that they have, I think the first, prerequisite, and that comes quite naturally, is that you need to be willing to listen to them, and you need to be interested in them. And that's why, if you speak about autocratic leadership and those kind of top-down behaviors, etc., yes, they can be quite successful in the workplace, and they can still, drive some significant results, but they will not be, the type of leadership that will empower your teams, that will make sure that they also contribute to the right extent of what they can achieve, and it can be very limited. And usually the limitation with those kind of leadership, when they're very mandatory, in their approach and their thinking, is that leaders will do very well, or the organization will do very well while you have those leaders in the organization. But the day that these leaders, leave, then because the rest of the team has not been empowered to think by themselves, then you come to a very difficult position. And that's why, I think there has been an evolution towards types of leadership that are much more inclusive in their approach and make sure that everybody can contribute to the right level of their capabilities. Because first of all, it's much more enjoyable to work in those organizations where you feel that you actually matter. And the other aspect is that it's much less disruptive and it's much more sustainable in the future if you have that type of thinking. So the type of personality and leadership, you need to have people that are genuinely interested in others. I think that's clear. But at the end of the day, if you look at those dimensions, meaning being able to speak about emotions and being able to acknowledge that you don't know everything, it's not, what is actually quite interesting is that it's not far-fetched. I think it's something that is very obvious when you think of it. You want to relate to people, then speak about yourself and speak about what you feel, not just about the business. Or if you want people to tell you, what's happening in the organization, start by acknowledging that you don't know everything and people will come and help you. So they're quite actually natural behaviors. What is quite interesting is that at some stage when we're thinking of how to build a business and how to lead an organization and how to lead a unit, we completely disconnected those kind of natural behavior to how we set up the workplace and the pyramidal hierarchical approach to doing the work, where we basically told that the leader knows everything and that we're here just to talk about business and not about what's happening beyond that. So it's quite interesting to see that dimension, that dynamic, that's something that was very natural or that seems very natural has been totally discarded from the workplace. And I think we spent like the last 20 years trying to bring it back into something that feels more human, actually.
It's so fascinating, everything that you're speaking about, Vincent. And a few kind of follow-up questions to the things you raised. The first one is speak up, be vulnerable with your team. And I'm sure you know the work of Brené Brown, and she talks about having a vulnerability, a shame hangover. So I was just wondering, is there a point at which people overshare and become now very uncomfortable about those new boundaries because it could be perceived as therapy or very therapeutic by some staff members are not necessarily comfortable with that kind of relationship? And a lot of this has got to do with our socialization in South Africa, I think. And I was interested to see, your sample group was global. So does culture play into this? And sorry, that was so many stacked questions.
So let's try to go one by one. And I may ask, you to rephrase some of the questions. I think the first piece was, what does that mean for leaders who need now to go into the emotional space when they're not very used to that? And is there a time when you can do too much of those kind of things? And to be honest, I think it really depends, and everybody has to find the leadership style that works for them. And you also need to adapt your leadership style according to your audience and according to your teams. So I would never suggest to anyone to push it beyond something that feels unnatural to them or that they're not willing to experiment. At the end of the day, I mean, you need to have human connection if you want people to trust you and if you want people to come forward and work, as a human being in your organization. So you always need to share a bit. And for me, that's something I learned the hard way in my own personal development, that at some stage in my career journey, I was very much focused on let's talk about the work. Let's leave all of the private, elements at the door, because I don't want to overstep into other people's, private life. I don't want to make them uncomfortable by asking them to share about something that they might not want to share in the workplace. And I was very, very clear of dividing those two and sticking only to the business area. But what I realized very quickly is that with the teams, the feedback I was getting is that I'm cold, I'm not understanding, I'm not empathetic. And actually it was exactly the opposite. I wanted to be like empathetic enough to make sure that they would only bring their private life whenever they felt comfortable. And by doing that, I was basically censoring any private discussion. And then it impacted the trust and impacted the functioning of the team. So it's something that I believe that you always need to have that, and you always need to create a space to have personal discussion. but you need to be very attuned to the emotions in the room and the emotions of people around you to say, okay, when is the right amount and when am I doing too much? Because as you said, I mean, it's not psychological therapy either that you need to drive in the workplace. I don't think that that's the place where you have those discussions. But on the other hand, and I think that's also something that the pandemic and the working from home has taught us, you need to understand what's happening in your team's, mind if you want to make sure that you can manage them the right way. And for me, I realized last year, for instance, by having those personal discussions, by making sure that we always start our meetings with a 5-minute, check up on how things are doing, how people are feeling, etc., you realize that a lot of people have gone through a lot of very stressful situations over the past few months, and you can't discard that from whatever they will bring in the workplace. I mean, their mind will be busy thinking of something else that is affecting them beyond work, and if you don't create a space to discuss about that, then they will never be able to be the best they can in your unit.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And then maybe just to speak a bit about how culture inputs into this dimension. Because although what you're saying is it's not that complicated, there's a lot of biases and ingrained thinking around leaders need to know all the answers. And, the assumption that if I don't know the answers, my staff are going to see me as incompetent. And that whole value in South Africa, it is still very much a male-dominated environment in leadership. So it seems to be part of our culture in South Africa. Did you find that the numbers, the statistics that you did with your bigger sample, were there any differences?
So for me, when it comes to the cultural aspect, there was one dimension I tried to assess to see whether that had an impact in the overall, relationship between voice and servant leadership, and that was what we call power distance. And power distance is basically the indication by which associates or people, in a country accept the fact that power is not distributed equally in a country. So the typical example, because that seems very theoretical, but the typical example is that in most Asian countries, people, for instance, will accept the fact that, leaders are in the positions and associates or followers are in a different position, and they will not question why the leader is there and why, they're in that place. They accept that kind of, hierarchy from the beginning. Whereas some of the Western countries, and usually you use the Scandinavian countries as an example, they're much more egalitarian in their approach. And if you are position on top of a team, you need to make sure that people, first of all, you need to have earned the right to be there, and you will always be questioned by your team with regards to why do we have that, and that kind of relationship or hierarchy is less accepted. It's much more difficult to have strong hierarchies in place in those cultures. So for me, what I did is try to assess to which extent that kind of cultural dimension affects speaking up in the workplace. And what I saw is that actually it didn't affect it, according to the sample I had, that the fact that people were either very happy with having a strong hierarchy in place or unhappy about, this kind of hierarchical approach didn't impact. People were speaking up or not speaking up. But I must say, I think my sample was not representative enough to be able to ascertain, the real dynamic that was happening here. And I would caution, that specific aspect of the research, because I think it would require much more analysis. But coming back also to some of the dimensions that you mentioned in the question, the fact that in organizations where you have the expectation that the leaders knows everything and cascade it down to the rest of the organization, yes, it will be extremely difficult if you want to reverse the pyramid and say, actually, I don't know that much, please help me and fill in the gaps, because people would not know exactly what's happening. Luckily enough for me, I work in an organization that is very clear on the fact that they want to develop servant leaders and servant leadership, and the fact that you're here at the service of your team and your team is at the service of the customers, and those kind of thinking, it's actually what is expected of you. So because there has been a strategy in terms of we want to go for that culture rather than the previous one that we had, really creates a space to act those behaviors and to role model those behaviors. It would be extremely difficult, I think, to try that if that was frowned upon in your organization, because you would be, in a very difficult situation trying to do what you think is best, but actually what is not accepted by the rest of your culture. And I don't think this is the kind of situation that is very easy to manage.
Yeah, thanks, Vincent. I mean, this has really sparked my thinking in a few different directions. And the one direction is really around innovation inside of organizations. And I know that constructs like people being proactive and championing ideas inside the organization go along with having a voice. So if you want to challenge the existing ideas and come up with new things, you need to be able to have forums, and you need to be able to have a culture where you can argue and critically argue for new ways of doing things. Has the literature found any, or have you in your experience found any links between promotive voice and proactivity and creativity and innovation inside of organizations?
Yeah, so Hilton, voice in general is linked to many, positive aspects in the organization. Innovation is one of those. And I think that that's actually one of the most critical ones. Why that explains, why organizations try to make sure that they foster voice mechanisms in the workplace, because it drives productivity, it drives also loyalty from the associates. And in that respect, that all goes in towards the same direction. I think what's interesting based on what I found, for me, let's say the onset of the research was like, okay, if we try servant leadership throughout the organization, then I'm quite sure, because of what I had seen in the literature, I was like, okay, if we try servant leadership, that means we will be able to unleash voices in the organization. And I wanted to see, okay, to which extent does it really happen, and what is it exactly in servant leadership that helps us to achieve that? The finding is actually quite interesting, because if you look especially for promotive voice, the only finding I had in my sample was that wisdom, or the lack of wisdom, is actually what drives promotive voice. And wisdom is not something that is related only to servant leadership. It relates to different forms of leadership. I mean, you always think that your leader needs to know something in order to be able to lead an organization. It's the same for autocratic leadership. It's the same for transformative leadership, and it's the same for many forms of leadership that you can think of. So actually, what the research tells me, or what I found out from the dissertation, was that it's not so much about the type of leadership that you use. Maybe we need to actually reverse the discussion and say, okay, who are the people in your organization that you basically work with, and how do you connect with each of them separately, and what is the exact mechanism that each of them will favor to give you the feedback? Because if you try something very general like servant leadership, it doesn't really work. I mean, there's nothing specific in servant leadership apart from the wisdom aspect that will drive them to speak up. So if there's nothing specific, then that means maybe we need to look not from the leader perspective, what they need to do generally to drive the speak up, but more with the follower or the associate, what do they need themselves in order to be able to speak up, knowing that each of them might have a different way to do that in a workplace.
Interesting. I wanted to ask, Vincent, I know that you're interested in coaching and you are a coach. How does this framework inform perhaps coaching, and how we can get leaders to embrace this type of thinking?
So maybe the best way to consider that is through the emotional aspects of the discussion that we had. I think, coaching, because you try to tap into the emotions of the people in the organization and try to link, these emotions, I mean, positive emotions, or what people want to achieve for themselves, what connects with their purpose, etc. Because through coaching, you tap into that, then you can link it back to how to help them and support them to speak up. So for me, that's the aspect. I think you can use coaching to better understand everybody's purpose, aspirations, and what they want to work towards, what makes sense for them, what really, make them tick, and where they have the biggest contribution, so that then you use that also to unleash the voice mechanisms and create a space for them to explain what they're going through.
I wonder, is there a downside? Excessive voice. I'm wondering if there's a place where it becomes counterproductive. If everybody's voice counts, And if there's a surplus of voice, can that immobilize the organization in some way that it just becomes so over democratic that decision making isn't done because everybody wants to weigh in?
Yes, and so it's not something I studied through the research, but here I can speak, based on personal experience. Yes, I think at some stage you can have, too much voice. And the same way that you can have too much information when you try to build your own strategy and develop, a business. And that's especially true for people who are democratic leaders. If you think yourself as a democratic leader and try to make sure that every decision that is made in an organization basically satisfies everyone in your organization, you will have an extremely hard time making progress towards the goal that you have set for the organization, because everybody will have a different opinion. We're human beings and we all think very differently. And I think this has been compounded by the fact that a lot of companies are also trying to expand on the diversity and inclusion front, meaning people want to have diverse people within their teams in order to make sure that they have different type of opinions in order to frame the best ideas that they can think of, having considered, all the different aspects of a problem. But when you do that, that means that at some stage you have to draw a line in terms of how much input you get and how you make up your mind finally. And I think that's also one of the reasons, ultimately, why you have such a predominant discussion now going around in terms of having leaders who are also storytellers. Because if you want to keep embarking the people within your organization, tell them, actually, your voice matters, but I won't follow all the time whatever you tell me, because I also need to make up my own mind. So if you want to reconcile those two aspects, how you make your decision while at the same time creating opportunities for people to voice what they think of, it requires a lot of efforts and subtle, discussions to frame a consistent story around that so that people keep being engaged in those discussions. Because at some times, people will just say, okay, nobody listens to me, and then I'm just not saying anything anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. Vincent, I was interested to ask, where to next for you? Your career history is so fascinating. You start off just with looking really at the numbers and the finances, and you're moving much more into, psychology and coaching. So where will we find you maybe in 2-3 years? What's your goals?
Colin, if I knew, I would be very happy with that. I don't know. For me, I love my company. That's a lovely place to work in. It has a fantastic culture. We're making impact because we're helping to save people's lives. So I'm very happy, at Novartis. But at the same stage, I'm also very interested in, as you said, coaching, business psychology, those kind of things. So for me, whatever makes sense, where I can reconcile those two aspects, I will be happy. I'm not sure there's an easy, answer to this one, and maybe I need to chase, those two aspirations and dreams in parallel. But what I know is that at the end of the day, it all needs to relate back to your purpose. And my purpose, the way I framed it, for myself, is basically to help people fulfill, their potentials and their dreams. And as long as whatever work I do at Novartis or outside of Novartis, through my studies, through the academic work or those kind of things, help me achieve that, I know I will be a happy man.
So Vincent, I wonder, maybe like through your research, what were some of the books or readings that you did that really inspired you that you would recommend?
Through the research, so let me think about this one, because if you think, most of the documents were actually academic papers, so they're not always easy to access if you listen to the podcast, for instance. But Colin mentioned Brené Brown as, a thought leader when it comes to thinking differently, daring leadership, how to make sure that you go into those uncomfortable situations and explore, what it means to speak about emotion, what it means to speak about, being an empathetic leader. I think she's definitely one of the great, thinker that you can consider. The other person that is quite, well known, or that you can find easily in the bookstore, is Simon Sinek, in the sense that he has written quite a few books on servant leadership and how that impacts the workplace. So he's also a good author to have a look into, or look at some of the TED Talks, because it helps to elaborate the thinking.
And then also on that note, Vincent, I was wondering, with the research that you did much of your leadership style change, or was that essentially the type of leader you were and that's why it interested you?
A bit of both, maybe. I would say. I think I was drawn toward this one. I wanted to fully understand to which extent being a servant leader can really help the organization. Because for us, it's a journey in my company that has started only 2 or 3 years ago. And I think a lot of leaders still struggle to understand, what that means to be a servant leader and what are the benefits of being a servant leader. For me, maybe it resonated a bit more, highly, because I might have, some aspects on my own personal leadership that relates more strongly to that. But there's also some drawbacks, in terms of servant leadership, because it's not always easy to make the separation between how you help and support, your team, and how you drive accountability within the team, and those aspects. They're not always, that easy to navigate. So for me, I knew that I had some kind of affinity towards servant leadership, and I wanted to understand the mechanism better. But what happened after the research was that basically I pushed and I leaned a bit more into some of the aspects. So trying to set up much more time with the team to speak about their feelings, their emotion, especially during COVID time. And to be honest, I still think that I haven't done that enough with my team, because the magnitude of the emotional changes and impact they had on their side was so significant that it really needed to be addressed, at some stage, to help and create the trust, to help and create, the sense of belonging and those kind of things. So I lean towards that much more than what I would have done naturally, because I'm much more, reserved usually in the workplace, but I still think I could have done it better. And the same way when it comes to acknowledging, the fact that you don't know everything. I mean, for me, last year, for instance, I started with a new team. We hired quite a lot of people. We have a very ambitious goal, and we have completely changed our strategy, and we go after, an objective that is very different from what we're doing in the past. So having done that, nobody knows exactly how to achieve the goal that we're setting up for ourselves. And that means that I have a team and I have an organization where everybody looks at each other to say, okay, we're doing something completely different, but so what's the way? Who can tell us, how to achieve that? And so the first, person they look to in terms of helping them figuring that out is basically me. And my response to them is that I don't know. You're actually the expert, so you need to help me here. My role is to help you make the decision process and to figure that out together. But you have actually more information that I might have myself. And those kind of situations, they're not very easy to deal with. And it's a lot of stress, for a lot of people in the organization. And I know, everybody is really trying hard to make sure that we navigate those kind of uncertainties. But at least having had the research and knowing that it's really valuable to acknowledge the fact that you don't know everything really helped me sometimes to push in that direction with the team and make sure that they are empowered at the right level.
I mean, it sounds like, Vincent, that kind of, a core element of this kind of leadership is really just that we connect as human beings, that we respect each other's boundaries, ideas, worldviews, and really just, we're all humans muddling through and just trying to make the best of it. But it sounds like, I guess with knowledge workers, this construct makes a lot of sense. But I would imagine that their environments, say, for example, the military, where much more authoritarian style of leadership is probably required. And maybe it's not even in the military. It just depends on the situation. So even in a crisis, in a corporate situation, that there's less time for voice and that leaders just have to be decisive and make decisions based on the best information they have available. So is there a situational kind of element to this that would make sense to you?
Yes, no, and I fully agree on that, Hilton. I wouldn't recommend to go for an inclusive servant leadership type of approach for crisis management, because because that would never work. And I think, that's what you experience when you have a servant leader. And for me, that's what I've experienced in my own journey. Whenever I tried that in crisis management, it never worked. People need decisions to be made and need decisions to be made fast. And so you need to adapt your style of leadership according to the situation that you face. I think what is important, and that's what, makes good leader are also, very valuable. When you are capable of changing your style of leadership according to situations and making sure that you make the best of the different tools that you have at your disposal, then it really creates value for the organization. I think what is usually difficult for people, who are part of the team, if the leaders start, changing from one style to the other, etc., is when they are not signaled what is happening. So, for instance, and now that's what I try, when there's a crisis, or where I see that, okay, we have struggled too much trying to make a decision here, and we need to go into more like executive mode and top-down decisions, then I just explain that, sorry, we've considered everything. I think that time has come for me to help out here and make sure that we move forward, because we have to move forward. And then you say, okay, we'll have to revert to executive decisions, top-down behaviors, and explain that just for that purpose or whatever. But at least people know exactly what's in your mind, and they're not caught by surprise that, okay, here something is happening that is very different from the experience that we had with that leader a couple of weeks ago, because otherwise that can be very disruptive. But I agree with you. I mean, you need to adapt your type of leadership according to the situation that you face. There's still an element that's knowing your people will help you. And even if you think of the military, I mean, you won't go forward on the front line and start, fighting for somebody else if you don't appreciate that person. I mean, you need to have an emotional connection in order to be able to bond with one another. And actually, I think that's something that the military does quite well in helping people through the experiences that they share together to create significant bond and know each other, so that when stress comes and when they have to face very difficult situations, they won't hesitate to jump and support each other.
And I'm just thinking a little bit about our culture at Omnicore. We recently did our talent engagement survey for this year and achieved amazing engagement. And I do think as leadership, Hilton, correct me if I'm wrong, we do tend to adopt a benevolent servant leadership at Omnicore, and we've got a very flat structure. So also just a lot of millennials in our team. And I'm wondering if this research that you did, and you spoke also a little bit about the social media introducing voice and permission, I think that drives the kind of culture that we're in. Just people can speak and be open, and there isn't a sense of hierarchy in our team.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, there's still a lot that we have to learn about building effective leadership in organizations, what it is. We try our best. I certainly think that we try to have an organization where voice is important, where we understand human connection between people. So, yeah, I mean, I do think we live that, and I think we see the results in our engagement survey. But it's always work in progress. I mean, there's always more to learn.
And then maybe just a good place to start wrapping it up. Vincent, when you look at the findings, what would you say are the things that just stood out the most for you in terms of the conclusion of your research?
So there were different things. I mean, for me, first of all, I thought that the cultural dimension would have an impact. It didn't. And I was actually quite surprised about that. And to be honest, that's still something, if I had to do it again, I would try to increase the sample to get a better understanding of exactly what was happening there. What really was also impactful is the fact that I thought that altruistic behaviors would actually drive voice in a much more significant way than actually showed up in the research. It wasn't that significant. And then the two findings, especially the one around wisdom, for me, it was so obvious. The fact that, if you don't know much, then that's how people will come and tell you, what you need to know, that I didn't even think that was important. But then when I started to write about it and look, what's the implication of that, it's actually quite significant. Because as you said, there is that expectation that a leader already has at least a big part of the answers, when that's actually not the case. And so, really reflecting on what that means to be able to acknowledge that you don't know everything, reflecting on how you do that without jeopardizing, your integrity and the perception that, you're still a leader in settings that may be more traditional in the way that they consider leadership was actually quite significant. And I think, it also led me to wonder, for instance, how do we ask about the thing that we don't know? I mean, do you go about and ask your team, so tell me what I don't know? You do that sometimes, but most of the time you don't you don't even have that kind of discussion happening in a team. Or if you think of the voice, channels that are created in the organization, you sometimes have this kind of, speak up campaigns, those kind of, how do you say? Yeah, reporting, lines. If you want to anonymously report something that is happening in the organization. But the way it's been framed is around, please report something that is not compliant. And people use it for uncompliant behaviors and as whistleblowers. But you don't, or those channels have never been positioned around, please tell us what we don't know. Or if you think of your climate survey, we ask how people feel, but we don't ask about, what we don't know. And I think, there might be something actually that we need to elaborate on how do we create mechanisms for people in the organization to tell us that we don't know, because maybe that's something that is so evident that we actually never thought exactly what it means and how you put those mechanisms in place. So these were some of the key, findings or things that I wasn't expecting from the research that came as a conclusion.
That's fascinating. I think your research really needs to go wider and be shared. And I hope that the podcast is just one mechanism that more people will hear about your findings, because I do think it's coming at the right time. This is definitely what organizations need. And certainly in our coaching space, probably the top reason executive leaders come into coaching is really for listening and for connection. A lot of it's got to do with EQ. So fascinating. It's really been wonderful to spend this time with you, Vincent, and hear your take. I think it's a very unique voice and very interesting research that you've brought into the industry. Hilton, closing thoughts from you?
Thanks, Vincent. I think that was a lot of great food for thought. And I'm interested to read more and go on a bit of a journey around this. So I'm sure our paths will cross again.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to help and contribute to the discussion. So I really appreciate giving me the space. Thanks to both of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vincent. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. We really hope you enjoyed the episode. It would help us a lot if you subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. Give us 5 stars if possible, and check out our website www.omnicore.co.za. You'll find our previous episodes and other blogs and helpful resources, and we look forward to connecting in the next episode.